Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. So today I'm going to talk to you about my experience having an ECV whilst high risk. Now, my polycystic ovaries wouldn't have affected it, but I did have low papp-a, which just increases your risks of complications as it is. I have Ehlers-Danlos, which means that I was more at risk of my waters breaking or my placenta detaching. It's not a massively high risk, but it's higher than the average person. And because of my BMI, I was at higher risk of it not working in the first place because it's harder for them to feel where the baby is. Now, I'm going to try and keep it short and sweet because I just did this video and it took like half an hour. So I'm going to try and shorten it quite a bit. So I was told that we needed to get the baby out as quickly as we possibly could because her head had stopped growing around 28 weeks and we weren't sure why. We did have a scan of her head and it didn't show her skull had fused or anything like that, so we weren't concerned at the beginning, but that did drop her to below the 0 percentile for her head size in the end, which was worrying. We didn't know why. Her head was always stuck at the top of my womb, so we assumed that it was because she was breech looking at the shape of her head, but it turned out to be a bit more complicated than that. So we decided, because of how high risk I am for an ECV and because obviously she hadn't turned the entire pregnancy to head down, that we would try an ECV. I think I just said that wrong. Because I'm high risk of C-section, we did an ECV. ECV I was high risk as well, but it's better than a C-section. So went in first thing in the morning with my partner and my best friend because they were basically my birthing partners. I had a second person due to my anxiety and she's amazing, but we went in probably around 7 in the morning, 8 in the morning, I can't remember exactly what time it was, and they did a scan of the baby to check the position of her and found obviously that she was still in transverse position, so she was like across me. We did a urine test, which they do every time you have an appointment. That came back all clear. We monitored, what else did we do? I had the injection for the ECV anyway. We did the scan. We did the monitor of the baby, which is basically like your heart rate monitor and the movement monitor to make sure that she wasn't already in distress and that she could cope with what was about to come, because it's not a pleasant thing for you or the baby. I had my anesthesiologist came in. She is amazing. She actually figured out that I had EDS with my son right at the end of the pregnancy when she gave me my consult and she got me diagnosed. She came in and asked me to put a cannula in because I'm higher risk and cannulas are difficult to do on me because of my weak veins, because of my Ehlers-Danlos. So she decided I don't react to local anaesthetic, so she brought a local anaesthetic for me to try, put it in my skin, and it was incredible because it actually worked, which I've never ever had in my life. I've had an eye flush, I've had a tooth pulled, and I've had a skin biopsy, and none of those times did any local anaesthetic actually work. So she found one that worked for me. It only worked on the surface, it didn't work in the epidural, but it did work on the surface. When we tested it, she gave me like a needle and she said to just gently scratch to see if it would work, and I was looking at it and I was like, I can still feel it, so I don't know if it's working. And I looked down and I was bleeding and she was like, did that hurt? No, you can feel it, but it didn't hurt, so it worked. And I was like, amazing. So yeah, she gave me the local, put in the cannula, which was difficult, but we managed to get it in, and they gave me gas and air basically because it's not a nice experience. I had a student in watching and I let her have a feel of where the baby is to see if she could figure out where the position of the baby is on a high BMI person. I had a midwife and a nurse, and the midwife was on the head end of the baby and the nurse was on the bum end of the baby, basically, because obviously the head's more fragile. They came in with the olive oil, put the olive oil all over me after they'd re-scanned to make sure where baby is, put the olive oil on me and started to do the manipulation. And basically they get you to take your gas and air if you want it. You don't have to, but it is really intense. I would recommend it. Get you to take your gas and air. You have your injection, which is to relax your womb, which you have probably about 30 seconds to a minute beforehand. It doesn't matter how long before, as long as it's within 20 minutes, because it wears off after 20 minutes. But you have your injection to relax the womb. That is no complications whatsoever with that. It's not going to cause issues if you have a heart condition. I've got a supraventricular tachycardia and it didn't affect me. It just makes you more aware of your heart rate, basically. It makes you feel anxious. So the midwife started pushing against where the head was, and the nurse was like holding the bum to stop the baby turning back, and they sort of tried to start turning the baby really gradually, and they managed to get her from transverse, kind of like a little bit more awkward positioned. Like they managed to move her bum up, but they couldn't get her head down. And at one point I felt this agonizing, searing pain, like a tug, and it felt like my insides had been ripped out even. And we didn't know why. Instantly we were all like, back off, take your hands off, panic mode, like check for bleeding, instant panic, because it was agonizing. I screamed and cried a lot. Obviously at that moment we were like, nope, stop, because we didn't know if it was because the cord was too short, or if the cord was around her neck and it was causing pressure, or if I had just managed to pull the placenta, which is a risk with an ECV. It's not a massive risk, but there is a risk of the placenta being pulled away slightly. None of it happened to me, luckily, but it was very intense, agonising pain. So we stopped. They kind of gave us a minute. I knew that it wouldn't work. I said from day one that an ECV would never work, and I was actually fighting having an ECV because I knew it wouldn't work, but I was pushed to do it because I'm less risk of an ECV and vaginal birth, which I'd had a vaginal birth before, than I was of a C-section when I've never had surgery before. Obviously, I was right and it didn't work, but I'm glad that I tried it because at least I gave it my all to try everything I could to get the baby to move. They apologised to me and said they were sorry that it didn't work and they hoped I was alright. They put the monitors back on me to check the baby wasn't distressed. Obviously, they did an ultrasound to see the position of the baby, just to make sure that baby hadn't gone into a really weird random position, and they looked for the heart rate to make sure they could find the heart was still beating regularly and normally. They put the monitor on me for another half hour to check she was okay, and she was kicking up a storm, so we knew she was fine. And we just had a really good cry and a swearing at the world, like, for God's sake, we actually have to do the C-section now. After all that, we have to go through a C-section as well. So it's a good thing I had my cannula in, because we didn't know when it would be. I didn't know if it would be an urgent one, because obviously I'm high risk of an emergency C-section after an ECV. So they left the room, let us have our cry, and after some time they came back in, probably around midday, 1 o'clock, and said to go upstairs to have an ultrasound to find out the exact position of the baby, like the more in-depth ultrasound to properly see the whole position, because they needed to see that the baby was still in something called a stable lie, because if they're on an unstable lie, it means nothing's covering the cervix. So if your waters break, which you're at higher risk of happening after an ECV because your membranes are broken down a little bit, it means if the baby's not covering the cervix, like properly covering it, whether it's with their bum, with their head, whatever, if the cervix isn't covered, if your waters do go, the umbilical cord can pull straight through and basically kill the baby in 3 minutes. So it's an emergency situation if that happened, and they couldn't risk that happening. Now, when I had my ultrasound, we found that the baby's head was in my rib. Her shoulder was more in my hip. Her back was along my cervix, and it wasn't low. It was like arched up. My cervix was like here and she was there, kind of on an awkward angle. Her bum was in my other hip and her foot was in my other rib. So she was literally like a moon around my abdomen, which was not a very comfortable position, but that's how she'd stuck herself. It's like an oblique position, they said it was, because it's not like straight across. She was on like an awkward wonky angle. So obviously that meant I had an unstable lie. I was taken back into the room where I'd had the ECV, and a woman came in 2 minutes later saying, "You ready to go upstairs?" And I was like, "I'm ready to leave," because no one had told me that apparently if you have an unstable lie with a baby, you're not allowed to leave the hospital because of this risk. I didn't know that, and I didn't think about it until afterwards, and I was like, kind of common sense, but no one mentioned it to me. If you have an unstable lie after an ECV, you can be kept into hospital until you have the baby, which I did. 5 days later, I had to wait 5 days in hospital, completely fine. Like, I didn't have any pain. I did have a couple of random contractions, but they weren't proper contractions. They were just because my womb was irritated because of the ECV. But I was in there for 5 days, watching people come in and out and in and out, having their babies, and I was just there like, kicking my heels because baby wouldn't move. No reason for me to be here, wasting resources. I felt awful for it. I really did, because I was like, everyone, all the midwives were up in arms because they had so many emergencies whilst I was there, and I was kind of like, you deal with everyone else, I can deal with myself. All I need is food and drink, because we weren't allowed to get our own. Someone had to get that for us, and I was like, literally, come in at meal times and I'm good. Come in for your rounds and I'm good. Leave me alone otherwise. I'll ring you if there's a problem. Just deal with everyone else. They actually need you. And I didn't. I didn't have my waters break or anything. Whilst I was in hospital, every single day someone came in, they'd have a feel for where the baby is, and she did change positions and move a lot, but her head was always stuck in the same place, and she never went into like a proper breech position, so we were constantly at high risk, so I wasn't allowed home, and we had the C-section the following Wednesday. So the ECV was on the Friday, C-section following Wednesday, and I was first in the queue. So that was basically my experience of an ECV. As I said, there were no complications, but it did fail. It wasn't comfortable, it was painful. And just to kind of throw this in there, the reason that the ECV failed, on top of my high BMI making it more difficult, the reason the ECV failed is we found out during my C-section that I actually have a bicornuate uterus, and that means that my uterus is completely heart-shaped. And we didn't know that with my son because he was head down at 24 weeks and he stayed head down. We didn't know why he stayed head down. He did have complications. He stopped growing and things. We didn't know why. Now we know why, because he was, they call it horns, so like each side is a horn, and he had his body stuck in one horn, but obviously because he was head down I was able to push him out and we weren't aware of it. With her head was stuck up in the right horn, which meant that her head had basically suctioned up there and couldn't move because she'd grown into the shape of the horn. It made it very difficult to get her out in the C-section. It did take a few minutes. With me under general anaesthetic, it was really difficult, but she did come out and she's totally fine now, and her head's kind of formed into the normal position now, luckily. There's no later risks or complications from it that we can tell. Her head has grown. They were worried because she was borderline microcephalic, which means that microcephaly is a condition where the head's too small, basically, and causes brain damage and stuff. She doesn't have the brain damage side. Her head has kind of plumped out, and it's kind of like a Popeye moment where he blows into his thumb and his muscles come up. And that's what the image that I kept having when her head was growing, because it was like, I think her head grew 6 centimetres in 3 weeks. So I was like, whoa. It's huge now. Well, not huge, but normal size. And it's lovely. But yeah, so everything is fine now. Obviously, I've had a C-section. But if you have any other questions about the ECV, I honestly can say if I had to do it again, I probably would. It wasn't good, and I'm not happy that it failed. And I'm not having any more kids, just to throw that out there. I can't have any more kids. But if I was going to do it again, I would, because the C-section, out of ECV, voluntary delivery, which was an induced labour, and a C-section, the C-section was 100% the worst for me. Most people say the C-section's better and the healing's worse. For me, the C-section was the worst thing I have ever had to go through, and I will talk to you about that in my C-section video later on, hopefully tomorrow. So yeah, that was my experience. I hope that this kind of helps you have an idea of how it goes, what happens. If you do have any questions, just let me know in the comments below and I will try to answer them as much as I can. Remember, I am not a professional or anything. This is just my experience with my high risks, but I want to share them because I looked so much for information on being high risk with BMI, EDS and everything, and found nothing. Really, I pretty much found no videos about it. I found no information about it because it's just not something that people know about yet. It's not a common thing. So I freaked out. So I'm hoping this is going to help you feel a little bit more at ease with the fact of I didn't have any complications related to EDS, high BMI or low papp-a, apart from the fact that the ECV didn't work. It's all related to my uterus shape, not that. So I hope this helps you. Like, comment and subscribe down below, and I will see you in the next one. Bye guys.